For a long time, I thought the goal of building a business was simply to generate more income. If revenue kept increasing, I assumed everything else would eventually take care of itself. But after the business reached a point where income became more stable, I started noticing a different problem. The money coming in didn't automatically turn into long-term wealth. Some of it disappeared into operating expenses. Some of it went into things that felt productive at the time, but didn't actually strengthen the system in any lasting way. That's when I started realizing something that most entrepreneurs eventually run into. Making money and allocating money are two completely different skills. And one of the most useful frameworks I've found for thinking about allocation is understanding asset classes. Not in the abstract investing sense people talk about online, but in a practical sense that actually relates to entrepreneurship. Because when income starts accumulating, every dollar has to go somewhere. And where that money goes quietly determines what the system becomes 5 or 10 years from now. Income is temporary. Assets are what make income durable. That distinction took me a while to fully understand. Early on, every dollar the business produced felt interchangeable. Money was money. If it helped the business grow or solved a problem, it felt like the right move. But over time, it became clear that different types of assets behave very differently. Some produce cash flow. Some appreciate slowly. Some strengthen the core business itself. Others simply preserve value. Once I started looking at money through that lens, decisions became easier to evaluate. Instead of asking whether something felt like a good opportunity, the question became much simpler. What type of asset is this? Because different asset classes serve different purposes in an entrepreneurial system. The first one most founders understand instinctively is the operating asset. That's the business itself. When we reinvest into the core company, better distribution, stronger systems, hiring the right operators, we're strengthening the asset that already produces income. For many entrepreneurs, this remains the most powerful place to deploy capital for a long time. A strong business can produce returns that most external investments can't match. But the business can't be the only asset. That realization usually comes after a few years of operating something successful. Because the company itself is still exposed to risk. Markets shift. Industries evolve. Customer behavior changes. So eventually, the conversation expands beyond the operating business. The second major asset class I started paying attention to was ownership assets. These are investments in other businesses, systems, or cash-flowing entities that the founder doesn't necessarily operate day to day. Sometimes it's acquiring a small company. Sometimes it's buying into a system that already produces revenue. The important part isn't control over operations. It's participation in the income stream. That idea opens a completely different way of thinking about growth. Because now capital can create income outside the original business. When capital begins creating income outside your effort, the system starts becoming more durable. Another category that becomes relevant over time is what I think of as stability assets. These aren't always exciting. They don't grow explosively, but they preserve capital and provide predictability. For many entrepreneurs, this eventually includes things like real estate or long-term financial investments. The role of these assets isn't necessarily rapid growth. It's stability. They create a foundation that doesn't depend entirely on business performance. When I first started thinking about asset classes this way, something interesting happened. The question, where should this money go, became much easier to answer. Instead of seeing one giant pool of capital, I started seeing different roles inside the system. Some capital strengthens the operating business. Some capital acquires new income streams. Some capital stabilizes the overall structure. Each decision becomes part of a larger architecture. And once that architecture becomes clear, the business starts feeling less fragile. Because everything isn't dependent on a single machine anymore. There are multiple sources of strength supporting the system. I've noticed that founders who build durable wealth tend to think this way naturally. They're not just focused on increasing revenue inside the business. They're quietly converting income into different types of assets over time. Operating assets, ownership assets, stability assets, each one serving a different purpose. Entrepreneurial wealth is rarely built from one asset. It's built from a structure of assets working together. That structure doesn't appear overnight. At the beginning, the operating business usually dominates everything. It produces the income. It demands the attention. It deserves most of the capital. But as the system matures, the founder's role begins shifting slightly. Instead of only building the machine, the job becomes shaping the ecosystem around it. Where capital flows, what assets are added, which pieces of the system should grow next. Those decisions compound quietly over time. 5 years later, the system might include several different types of assets. 10 years later, the architecture can look completely different from the original business that started it all. And looking back, the shift often begins with something surprisingly simple: not earning more money, but understanding the different forms that money can become. Because the real transformation happens when income stops being the final goal and starts becoming the raw material used to build assets.